Good afternoon. Start with a little apology. I'm very late out with my uploads today. I've been on a little shopping trip in Finland. So, yeah, took a while before I got back. I'm going to continue with my series on the World Championship between Ding and Jan Nepomniachtchi. We're in game 4, and Nepomniachtchi won game 2. Game 1 and 3 were draws. I've got to say that in this match, a lot of the draws were very fighting draws. They weren't like the players were choosing deliberately drawish lines and just getting draws. They were going for it. None of them quite managed to get a win many times, but they tried. So it was a good, exciting chess, despite the fact there was many draws. Just worth mentioning also that this World Championship was played because Magnus Carlsen wasn't interested in defending his world title again, so he relinquished it. And then the final in the World Championship was between the winner of the candidates, which was Jan Nepomniachtchi, who won the candidates for the second time in a row, and Ding Liren, who came in second place in the candidates. So, okay, here's game 3, and Ding has the white pieces and plays c4, the English opening. Nepo plays knight f6. If it goes to d4 now, then he's in an ordinary Queen's Gambit decline type of position. But Ding plays knight c3, so that d4 isn't really playable at this time. And this goes away from many Queen's Gambit declined ideas. It's still possible to play e6 and then d5, but he decides that okay, he plays e5, a so-called excuse me, a so-called reverse Sicilian structure, but officially titled the English Opening Two Knights variation. Two knights because there's two knights. Interestingly enough, c4, the English Opening, was first used by German chess masters in Bremen, in a tournament in Bremen, and it was known as the Bremen Opening. But the English players took it up with such understanding and such good play that it became more known as the English Opening. I think it might still be called the Bremen Opening in Germany. I'm not sure, but I think so. Which is a bit like the Scotch Opening, invented by English players, improved, perfected, if you will, by Scottish players, from a match in 1824 between Edinburgh and London. Might have been telegraph match. It might have just been ordinary postal match, but it was a correspondence match anyway. Sorry, wittering on about chess. That's my job, you understand. So, Ding brings out his other knight, threatening the pawn. It doesn't really work at this moment, pushing the pawn, because even although it's defended by the knight, Ding could then come here with his knight and he's got two threats on the pawn. Alright, you could then defend with his queen, but then you're getting your queen out in the open, and this is probably not the best idea for white, for black, but he doesn't do it anyway. He just carries on with sensible development, develops his pawn, and no one who develops the pawn, e5, playing e4 becomes a more reasonable threat. d3 is played, typically e3 or d3 is played in these English structures. d3 signals the Botvinnik type structures where pawns come to d4, d3 and e4 to make a little upside down triangle along with the c4 pawn. But this time he plays to e3 to give him a bit more grip over the d4 square which they're fighting over. Nepo has the pawn and the knight looking at c4, and until this move Ding just had the knight, so the pawn looks over the move to stop knight to e4, d4 being a possibility. Not that he could do it just yet because the pawn on e5 is undefended, but there working on longer term targets here. So the bishop comes, and this is in some ways similar to a Nympho-Indian, except the pawn hasn't been moved here. But also this move in Nympho type lines is known as the anti-Nympho-Indian. But anyway, the queen comes out and develops and supports the pawn, the knight, and the knight is taken immediately by the bishop. It might seem like why is he giving up the bishop pair at so early a stage? It's because he wants to fight for control over the e4 square. So if the queen takes, he can play e4 immediately and chase the knight away, and then it's never really getting back into the game. So therefore the pawn takes, leaving these double pawns exactly like in the Nympho-Indian. But because the knight's here, they're maybe a bit stronger. It maybe gives him the possibility of playing d4 a little bit quicker. So d6 is played to support this pawn, and e4 is played immediately. Nepo castles. Yeah, and the bishop comes to b2, e2. So just normal development. h5. Well, I'm not keen on moving a developed piece for a second time before moving another piece, but he is looking at the square f4, which then would look at both g2 and e2. So if the knight gets to c4, f4 unmolested, it's going to be doing well. So this rushes Ding into playing d4 before he might be completely ready. Sorry. The knight comes to f4 anyway, threatening this pawn, threatening this bishop. It can't be tolerated there, and it gets taken straight away. And in some ways, black has given up the centre to white. He has a majority of pawns in the centre, but it's 4 against 3 on the king side for Nepo. We can discount this pawn because it's past the other pawns. It doesn't really take part in being a part of the king side, even though technically it is a king side pawn. So Ding castles, and Nepo supports the f pawn and attacks the d pawn. Makes it harder for black to play successfully e5 as well. So the rook supports, making it more possible to play e5, and the rook contends the not yet open e file, and the bishop comes to e3. So now there might be possibilities of encouraging some captures on this square and then playing bishop here. Check. So the bishop comes to d4, g4 even, and the knight comes back to d2 to support this pawn. The knight comes to a5. Again, he's moved his knight for a second time. I'm not really a big fan. And I remember that famous game between Spassky and Tal. I'm going to say Spassky and Tal. Maybe Spassky and Petrosian, where Spassky played his knight here to a5, and it was out of play the rest of the game. So, will this be such a case? We'll have to see. So, Ding opens up defense of this square, can use the bishop here, and he would be happy to see the capture here. Just as well he'd be happy to see the capture here because that's what we see. And Ding takes the chance to play e5 and attack the queen. Queen's got to retreat, and he plays d5. So he's given up a pawn. It's a pawn sacrifice, but look at the great pawn centre he has created, and it's really difficult for black to attack this pawn centre. If he plays f6, then the pawn will come to e6 unmolested. If he plays c6, the pawn will come to d6 unmolested. So it looks like if black tries to attack this reasonably strong centre, then it will create an advanced pass pawn for Ding. Is it worth it for the cost of this the pawn? Well, we'll have to wait and see. So rook comes to d8, an attack on the d pawn immediately. So it's supported by the pawn. And the pawn comes to d6. This isn't so much to support this pawn, though it does support this pawn, but the idea is to give this knight a place to retreat to. At the moment, the knight doesn't have anywhere to retreat to because this pawn has taken away its only retreat square. So this opens up a not very good retreat square for the knight, but nevertheless it's a retreat square, and he might be able to think about playing to g7 and finding his way back into the game for now. But definitely the knight is a bit locked out of proceedings at the moment. So he plays h3 and attacks the bishop. Now here Nepo has to consider, can I play bishop takes pawn, pawn takes bishop, queen takes bishop, pawn, and then I've got 3 pawns for the bishop, which is about level material, and the king is very exposed. But there are a couple of problems with that. That this pawn here would then be open to attack by these two, and that this knight still isn't in the game and is going to take a considerable amount of time to find a good square in the game. So he thinks better of the sacrifice and retreats his bishop. And now the bishop comes to d4, e4 even. Great, much better. Centralized square. It can be supported by a pawn. It also gives access to this square for the knight. So yeah, it's a good move. The rook comes to d7. Unfortunately, e7 even. Now, the rooks don't defend one another anymore, but there isn't a quick way of exploiting this for Ding. So he plays queen to c3 in anticipation of Nepo doubling on the e file with the rook so that the pawn is still defended. And he does indeed double with the rooks. And Ding retreats the bishop to c3 where it's defended by the knight and where the rook now defends the d pawn. It might have been possible just to let the rook take the d pawn, and then it may have been possible at some point to look at ways of playing bishop takes h7 to win the rook on d5. So if he just left the bishop there and the rook takes, then bishop takes pawn check, and he overwhelms the rook, wins the rook for it. So he gets that way in exchange, but he doesn't do that. And Nepo plays knight to b7. Another good point with the doubling of the rooks is that opens up the square. e8 for the knight to begin finding a way back into the game. So he looks towards doing his own turn. Rook doubling. Getting confused with my languages there. So now that you know that turn is Norwegian for rook, it means tower because it looks like a tower. So 11 you learn. Anyway, pawn comes to f6 to attack the white centre. But now the pawn comes to f6, and as I mentioned before, this, when you move a pawn, yeah, you gain things like an attack on the e5 square, but you give up things like the defense of the e6 square. And now this pawn is just 2 moves away from queening and might even be able to be supported by a pawn on d6 soon enough. So yeah. But when he pushes this pawn, as I said, you gain things with pushing pawns, you give up things. And this square is given up by the push of this pawn. It was covered before, it isn't now. And that allows the knight to come to d6, a quicker and easier way to get back into the game. So he's done well at getting his knight back into the game in a reasonably active position. And who knows, f5 might be a possible square. Not at the moment though, because then you would be facing a pawn fork on g4. Oh, well, he could take on, pass on. Yeah, okay, might just get away with that. So, he doubles the rooks anyway, and the knight comes, as advertised, to f5. Good square. So he gets rid of the bishop, and plays the rook to attack the f-pawn. This f-pawn proves to be very, very difficult to defend. Yes, he could defend by playing queen here, but then the queen will come here and attack the pawn. He could defend by playing pawn here, but that is a tremendous weakening of his position. So he defends the pawn by playing queen to h6, and the queen comes to f3, Knight comes to d4, attacking the queen. So yeah, that idea of attacking the pawn another time like this, yeah, that didn't go anywhere. But now Ding uncorks a beauty, and he gives away a exchange. Takes the knight. It costs him a rook. And he's already a pawn down, so he's playing with a rook. He's playing with the knight against a rook and pawn. Normally this would be a big disadvantage to white, but it is going to be really difficult for black to stop these pawns advancing on the white side. The pawn on d5 will be weak, and the knight has access to the e4 square. Forward from there, it might be possible that he can play queen to e4 and then knight to f3. You know, it's looking reasonable. Anyway, the pawn is taken, and the knight attacks the pawn on d4 immediately. This isn't possible to defend. So he defends his structure another way, but as I pointed out before, this really is a tremendous weakening of his whole pawn structure. And Ding gets a pawn, and of course he's threatening immediately to come to f5. Knife on f5, as Kasparov used to say, and for the rook and knight, get his exchange back. And if he gets his exchange back, they're playing with absolutely equal material, but of course Nepo's structure isn't anywhere near as good as Ding's. So the queen comes to g6 to prevent the knight from coming to f5. The pawn comes to g5 to try and reinforce. Okay, I'm going to play this anyway. And if the pawn is taken en passant, well then the square is now defended by the queen. So maybe he can play knight to f5 anyway. So he takes en passant, and Ding takes back. Now he is threatening to play knight to f5. Can't really be stopped. Pawn comes to h5, and the knight comes as advertised to f5, attacking the rook on e7. The rook comes to h7, and the queen, now comes to e4, and now he's threatening, for example, knight here, check, and a fork on the queen. So king comes to h8 to get out of the way of that fork. Pawn comes to h7. And so now it's looking like Nepo will have to give up a rook for a knight to stop that pawn. So it's looking like Ding will get his material back. And it's now 6 pawns each. So it's looking like he might get back to equal material, but it's quite likely he will be getting to equal material in a position which is much more promising for white than it is for black. So the queen comes to f7. Yeah, maybe he's threatening to take the pawn here. No, not yet, but it's a good defensive and attacking square. And the pawn comes to d6. So he's threatening to play pawn to d7 and get a new queen. That pawn's taken, but he takes with the knight, threatening the queen. And if Nepo takes with the queen, then Ding will take with the knight on e8, and the rook is defending the queen. And so then he'll be a whole knight up. So he can't allow that, so he has to retreat to g8. But then he takes the rook, and now it's a completely level material. 5 pawns, a rook and queen each. But Ding has a pawn on f7, e7, one move away from queening. This will create a great deal of pressure for his opponent. So he plays queen to e6, threatening the pawn on f6. King comes to g7 to defend, and the rook comes to f1 to attack the pawn again. The rook comes to h6 to attack, and the rook comes to d1, threatening to come here and force through the queen. He comes to f5, so that he's threatening the queen. But the queen says check. The king comes to f7. The queen takes the pawn, check. If he takes the pawn with the king now, rook comes here and wins the queen, so he can't afford to do that. So he puts the rook in the way. But then the queen comes to h7 check. The king has to come to e6. Can't come here because it's covered by the queen. And he threatens the rook and the pawn. If the queen takes the pawn, then the rook comes here, says check, and wins the pawn behind it. So the rook comes to g6 to fight over the square. And the queen comes to f8. And now if he takes, of course, it will be check. And we'll get a new queen and say check, so he can't take. If he tries to attack the queen here, then the rook will come here and chase the king away from its attack on the g-pawn, and then take the queen, and then either win these two pawns or force through the e-pawn and get a new queen. So the pawn very quickly became unstoppable. A really good positional game from Ding, a game which had seemed fairly even for a long time, but which suddenly Ding was able to take complete control of and force through almost one of his pawns. So after 4 games, the match is level at 1 win each. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe on my videos. Thanks, bye.